When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart didn't skip because I feared being caught. It skipped because I remembered those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I reached out to snatch the phone back, but he pulled away faster, eyes locked on the screen as his expression started to shift. I watched the subtle change in his brow, the tension tightening his jawline, and I could almost hear the ticking of my world unraveling. Yes, he was about to see the truth. But not the whole truth. Just enough to destroy what we had left. His fingers trembled as he kept swiping, and I knew he was nearing that one message. The one that would end it all. Or confuse everything even more. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I've had since college. My nerves collided with dread, with the unbearable weight of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it from across the room, sharp and uneven. This was what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that changed everything forever. And now, I don't know what happens next. But let me tell you how it began. Before I reveal the secret I tried so desperately to keep hidden, write in the comments where you're watching this from, and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with everything you had, but in the end, couldn't? It didn't start with some dramatic fight. No shouting. No betrayal. Nothing burned or broke. That's what makes it harder to explain. My marriage wasn't bad. It wasn't great either, but it functioned. We were one of those couples people looked at and assumed everything was fine. Quiet house, dinner at 7, vacation once a year, and polite smiles in photos. We had routine, predictability, a kind of safety net made of compromise. But I was vanishing inside it, piece by piece. It began with a favor. A simple, innocent favor. A friend of mine, well, more of an acquaintance these days, asked if I would be willing to volunteer for an art project. A photography series focusing on women over 50. Real faces, real stories, she said. I laughed it off at first. I didn't see myself as the kind of woman anyone would want to photograph. I didn't even like looking at myself in the mirror most days. But the idea stayed with me longer than I expected. I think it was because, lately, I felt invisible. My husband didn't do anything wrong, exactly. But he'd stopped seeing me. Really seeing me. The way he used to glance up when I walked into a room, or touch my arm absent-mindedly when we passed each other in the hallway. All of that had slowly eroded into silence. We were comfortable, yes, but the kind of comfort that numbs rather than nurtures. So I said yes. The studio was tucked behind a flower shop downtown. It had high ceilings, exposed brick, and smelled faintly of paint and stale coffee. The photographer, he was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, greeted me with a soft smile and the kind of eyes that noticed things most people missed. He wasn't flirtatious. Not in the obvious way. But he had a calm attentiveness that made me feel seen. He asked me to sit in a chair near the window where the light fell in long golden streaks across the floor. You don't need to pose, he said. Just breathe. So I did. He didn't rush. He didn't direct much. A tilt of the head here, a slow inhale there. And in between frames, he asked questions, not nosy, but thoughtful. What books I liked. What music I listened to when I cooked. He never once mentioned my age. And somehow, that felt like the most respectful thing of all. When I left the studio that day, I felt different. Lighter. Like something dormant inside me had stirred, stretched, and blinked in the sun. I didn't tell my husband. Not because it was a secret, but because I knew he'd ask questions. And I didn't want to explain why I wanted to do something just for myself. That was the part that stung the most. The realization that even sharing something as small as a photo shoot would feel like crossing a line. A few days later, the photographer emailed me a preview. It took me a full minute to realize I was looking at myself. The woman in the photo wasn't glamorous or airbrushed. There were lines around her eyes, a small mole on her neck I'd always hated, and her hair had that slight uneven wave it got when it air-dried. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked alive. That image haunted me. I opened the file more times than I can count. I stared at it late at night while my husband snored beside me, the blue glow of my phone lighting up the sheets. I zoomed in on my own eyes. There was a spark there. Something fragile, but unmistakably present. The next day, I responded to the email with a short message, "Would you be open to another session?" His reply came quickly. "Of course. I'd be honored." We scheduled it for the following week. I told my husband I was going to help my friend with her gallery prep again. He nodded without looking up from his laptop. I waited, almost hoping he'd ask a follow-up. Anything to show he was listening. But he didn't. Just muttered, "Drive safe," and went back to work. The second session was even more relaxed. We talked more this time. About creativity. About aging. He told me I had expressive hands and that they moved like I was always conducting a silent symphony. I laughed at that. No one had ever paid attention to my hands before. After the shoot, he asked if I wanted to see some of the raw images. We stood side by side at his computer while he clicked through them. "That one," I said softly, pointing at a frame where I was looking down, caught mid-laugh. "That doesn't even look like me." He turned to me then, eyes thoughtful. "I think that's the most you won yet." I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't say anything at all. That night, I lay in bed with my husband beside me, the air between us still and stale. I turned away from him and stared at the wall, the image from the studio burning behind my eyelids. I didn't touch him. He didn't touch me. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe I wasn't just invisible. Maybe I had already disappeared. The studio felt warmer the second time. Not physically, though the afternoon sun pouring through the dusty windows gave it a glow, but in the way that spaces feel when they begin to hold memory. Familiarity. My own coat hung on the back of the chair I'd sat in last week. A mug, not new, waited near the corner of the desk, as if left there for me. He greeted me with a soft nod, camera already slung around his neck. No small talk. No awkward pleasantries. It was like we'd skipped the polite beginnings and settled into something quieter. I didn't know if that was comforting or dangerous. He'd moved the backdrop. Today it was a deep, neutral gray, almost charcoal. There were no props, no elaborate lighting setups. Just me, a chair, and that lens that somehow stripped away everything unnecessary. As I stepped into position, I felt my fingers twitch with an energy I couldn't name. The shoot began slowly. He barely spoke, only offering an occasional "hold that," or "look slightly to your right." Most of the time, he moved around me in circles, clicking the shutter in rhythm with his breath. At one point, he stopped and walked over, adjusting the collar of my blouse with a soft tug. His fingers brushed against my neck, brief, gentle, intentional. Not sexual. But not neutral either. I swallowed hard. He stepped back again, raised the camera. The room was so quiet I could hear the click of the shutter echo off the exposed brick. I looked straight into the lens, not thinking of how I looked but of how I felt, raw, uncertain, full of unsaid things. My mind wandered to all the mornings I'd stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying foundation to cover the hollowness beneath my eyes. This was different. He didn't ask me to hide. At some point, I shifted my position and noticed that the scarf I'd worn was slipping. I moved to fix it, but he gently motioned for me to stop. "Leave it," he said, voice low but clear. "It's perfect." I froze, uncertain. But I did as he said. The scarf, once neatly tied, now fell loosely around my shoulders, revealing the base of my neck. I wasn't used to feeling bare. Exposed, not in the literal sense, but in the way a person can feel when someone else is watching without judgment or expectation. We continued shooting in silence for another 20 minutes. When we were done, he walked over and offered me water. I nodded, taking the bottle and sitting down. My legs trembled slightly, more from what I felt than from the effort of standing. He sat across from me, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're different today," he said. I looked at him, unsure of what he meant. "Last time, you seemed unsure. Like you were still waiting for permission. Today, you took up space." I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't realized I was doing anything different. But maybe I was. Maybe something inside me had shifted, even slightly. I took a long sip of water and set the bottle down, then turned my gaze toward the window. Outside, people passed without noticing us. They had their own lives, their own rhythms. I wondered what I looked like to them, if I looked like a woman quietly slipping out of one life and into another. He stood up and walked to his laptop, connected the camera, and began importing the files. The screen filled with thumbnails, some blurred, some sharp, all of them me. But not the version of me I knew. These images had depth. There was weight behind the eyes, complexity in the posture. I wasn't just a subject. I was a presence. He clicked on one and enlarged it. "There," he said. "That one." I stepped closer. It was a profile shot, my eyes down, lips parted slightly, hands folded gently in my lap. There was a kind of softness to it, but also quiet defiance. I stared at it, not with vanity, but with confusion. "I don't recognize myself," I whispered. "That's not a bad thing," he replied. Silence fell again. Then, something subtle happened. A change in the air, a shift in our proximity. I didn't step back, and he didn't move forward. We just stood there, the image of me frozen on the screen between us. He looked at me, not like a photographer, not like a man sizing up a woman, but like someone seeing a moment arrive and deciding not to interrupt it. And then, without any warning, without any pretense or dramatic build-up, we kissed. We kissed. It wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was deliberate. Slow. Like both of us had decided, in that exact second, that pretending wasn't serving anyone anymore. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, not for guilt or permission, but understanding. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My heart was thudding in my chest, not from desire, but from the terrifying clarity that what had just happened was going to change everything. I gathered my things in silence. As I reached for the door, he said nothing. I think we both understood there was nothing useful to say. I stepped outside, and the cool air hit me like a wave. I breathed in, long and hard, trying to steady the ground beneath me. Driving home, I kept replaying the moment in my mind. Not just the kiss, but the space before and after. The silence. The way he looked at me. The way I didn't look away. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel with fingers that had finally stopped trembling. The porch light was on. My husband was probably inside, finishing a spreadsheet, watching the news, thinking about tomorrow's meetings. And I was still thinking about today. About the weight of two lips meeting for the first time. About what it meant. About what I'd done. And about what I hadn't done yet. I walked into the house. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee. He looked up briefly, gave me a half-smile, and asked, "Long day?" I nodded, hanging up my coat. "Yeah. Just a lot going on." He went back to his cup. And I stood there, in the hallway, trying to understand how it was possible to feel both more alive and more hollow than I had in years. Because something had started. And I didn't know how, or if it could be undone. The morning after the kiss, I woke up earlier than usual, though I hadn't slept well at all. My body felt heavy, not from physical exhaustion, but from the mental weight of something I couldn't yet define. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar morning sounds in the house, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the soft buzz of my husband's electric razor through the closed bathroom door. Everything felt the same. And yet nothing did. I eventually forced myself up and walked downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen light was already on, and the scent of toast lingered in the air. A used butter knife rested on the counter, beside an open jar of jam. He'd already had breakfast. I stood at the counter, pouring coffee slowly, almost absent-mindedly, as if giving my hands something to do would silence the noise in my head. He walked in a few minutes later, tie already knotted, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, perpetually tired, but composed, like always. "You've got that gallery thing again today?" he asked, reaching for his travel mug. I nodded. "Yeah. Final round of approvals. They want to get everything framed by next week." He grunted softly in response. No follow-up. No real curiosity. Just a surface-level check-in, like confirming a weather forecast. I wondered what he'd say if I told him the truth. That I wasn't going to the gallery today. That I wasn't even sure what I was doing. That something had shifted, and I couldn't seem to unfeel it. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I handed him the sugar jar. He sweetened his coffee, took a sip, and then kissed the top of my head in a mechanical, practiced gesture before heading out the door. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was absolute. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, trying to reconcile the two versions of myself that now seemed to be coexisting. One who had been kissed in a studio by a man who looked at her like she was art. And another who just handed her husband sugar like she had for the past 20 years. It wasn't guilt that settled in me. Not yet. It was confusion. Not about the act itself, it had been brief, simple, strangely inevitable, but about the space it opened up inside me. A room I hadn't entered in years. A room where I was allowed to want. The rest of the day unfolded in slow motion. I didn't go to the gallery. I drove around aimlessly for an hour, letting the car take me through neighborhoods I didn't normally visit. I parked in front of a park I hadn't been to since my son was young and sat there for nearly 30 minutes, watching joggers pass, listening to the rustle of leaves. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the studio again. I didn't go in. I just sat there, engine off, staring at the front door. It was locked, lights off. No sign of him. I hadn't told him I was coming. Maybe I wasn't even supposed to be here. But a part of me had hoped he'd be inside, working, maybe glancing up through the window and seeing me. Acknowledge me. Offer some sort of answer to the question I hadn't yet asked. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Later that afternoon, I returned home and tried to act as if the day had been productive. I rearranged a few books on the living room shelf, folded laundry that had been sitting in the dryer for days, and responded to emails with a kind of numb efficiency. Dinner was quiet. He talked about a new hire at work. I nodded at the appropriate places, even smiled once or twice. My body was present, but my mind was elsewhere. Not with the photographer, specifically, but with the version of myself that had woken up in that studio. The woman in those photographs. The woman who hadn't looked away. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs. I opened my laptop and stared at the desktop screen for a long time before opening the folder where I'd saved the images he'd sent me. They were all still there. I clicked on one. Then another. Each image felt like a small rebellion. A quiet defiance against the roles I'd accepted without question. Wife. Mother. Hostess. Helper. Woman in the background. In these photos, I was none of those things. Or perhaps all of them at once, but seen through a lens that didn't reduce or confine me. The next day, he messaged me. A simple line, "Would you like to come in for one last session? I think we're close." Close to what? I didn't know. I read the message 3 times before replying. Yes, I typed. Let me know when. He responded within minutes. Tomorrow. Late afternoon. Lights best around then. I stared at the screen, rereading the exchange like it might change under my eyes. Then I closed the laptop and exhaled. That night, I didn't sleep much again. My thoughts spun, not with fantasies or guilt, but with tension. A tension I couldn't resolve, a question I couldn't articulate. The next afternoon, I told my husband I had a gallery meeting again. He barely looked up. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles pale. I tried to imagine this as just another shoot. Another routine step in the project. But nothing about this felt routine anymore. When I arrived, he was already inside. He greeted me with a nod, like before, but his expression was unreadable. There was no reference to the last session. No acknowledgement of what had passed between us. And maybe that was the only way this could work. We began shooting almost immediately. This time, the light was softer, more diffused. He asked me to sit on the floor near the window. No chair. No props. Just me and the fading sun. As the session continued, I found myself relaxing into it. Not posing, but being. Breathing. Letting go. For a few moments, I forgot what time it was. Where I was supposed to be. Who I was supposed to be. And when we finished, he said nothing. He simply nodded, showed me the images on his screen, quiet, intimate, almost meditative, and then closed the file. I gathered my things slowly, unsure of what to say, if anything. At the door, I turned to him. He didn't move, didn't speak. We stood there for a beat too long, the air thick with things left unsaid. Then I opened the door and stepped out. The light outside had changed. And so had I. The next few days passed in a blur, though I moved through them with careful precision, like someone crossing a frozen lake, unsure where the cracks might lie. I performed every routine to the letter: laundry, groceries, dinner, polite conversation, each task a thread in the tapestry I was desperately trying to keep intact. But inside, the threads were unraveling, one by one. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing. Sometimes he reached out in his sleep, resting a hand absent-mindedly on my hip or shoulder. It used to comfort me. Now it made me feel like a memory. Like a habit he wasn't even aware he'd formed. I checked my phone more than I should have, waiting for another message from the photographer, even though I had no idea what I wanted him to say. There was no logical next step. No plan. Just a strange sense of momentum, like I'd already passed a point I couldn't return from. Then, on Thursday afternoon, the gallery called. They wanted to meet with me about the upcoming exhibit. The curator had seen some of the latest photos and believed they were strong enough to anchor the show. My name would be featured prominently. The portraits, they said, had emotional depth. A quiet tension. Something people would connect with. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear, nodding along even though they couldn't see me. I said thank you, that I'd be honored. I scheduled the meeting for the following week. Then I set the phone down and just stared at the wall. I hadn't told my husband about the exhibit. Not because I was hiding it, at least, that's what I told myself, but because he hadn't asked. Not really. His interest in my world had dwindled to polite surface-level inquiries, the kind you ask out of obligation more than curiosity. At first, I had mourned the absence. Now I'd grown used to it. Later that evening, he came home later than usual. I was already in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, the scent of garlic and thyme thick in the air. He placed his bag by the door, loosened his tie, and leaned against the doorway. "Smells good," he said. I smiled faintly, not turning away from the stove. Thought I'd try that recipe from the magazine. He didn't ask which magazine. He never did. We ate in silence, the kind that had become more common between us, not uncomfortable, just quiet. After dinner, he watched the news while I cleaned the kitchen. The clatter of dishes was the only real sound between us. That night, while he showered, I opened the photo folder again. This time, I looked through them more deliberately, as if trying to answer a question that had been forming in the back of my mind. What was it, exactly, that I was searching for in these images? It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't even about being desired. It was about being known. Each image felt like a piece of a story I hadn't known I was telling. A version of myself I hadn't fully met. One who looked out from the frame with clarity, purpose, and something resembling defiance. The next day, I received another message from the photographer. I found a space we could use for the final set. It's outside the city. Quiet, good light. I think it'll give us something different. Let me know if you're interested. My fingers hovered over the screen. The phrase "final set" stood out. Like we both knew this couldn't continue forever. Like we were bracing for an end we hadn't yet named. I typed back, "Where is it?" He replied with an address and a time. Sunday afternoon. Late enough for the best light. He added nothing else. That Sunday, I told my husband I was helping a friend with a charity event. He didn't question it. Just kissed me on the cheek and reminded me to take a jacket in case it got cold. The drive took nearly an hour. The roads narrowed as I left the city behind, eventually giving way to tree-lined lanes and open fields. The location was a small, abandoned greenhouse tucked behind an old property. The glass panes were streaked with dust, but the structure itself was intact. Sunlight filtered through the slats, casting soft, broken patterns on the floor. He was already there, setting up his equipment. When I arrived, he didn't say much. Just nodded toward a bench near the center of the space and gestured for me to sit. "This place feels forgotten," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. He looked at me, then at the space around us. "That's what makes it perfect." The session began like the others, but there was a new stillness to it. A kind of weight. Neither of us spoke as he moved through the space, circling, adjusting, clicking the shutter with measured care. I sat still, letting the light fall over me in fractured beams. I wasn't posing. I wasn't thinking about angles or expressions. I was simply being. At one point, he asked me to stand by the far wall. The paint was peeling in soft curls, and a vine had begun to crawl through a broken window nearby. I leaned against the rough surface and looked away from the camera, into the distance, my thoughts somewhere between memory and anticipation. When he lowered the camera, he didn't speak. He simply looked at me, really looked. And for a moment, I felt everything in the room narrow to a single point. He stepped closer. We didn't touch. Not then. But something passed between us, a current, an acknowledgement. The silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Like language would only distort it. I left before the sun fully dipped. The drive back felt longer, heavier. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. When I walked through the door, the house was dim. The TV was on, low volume, playing something forgettable. My husband sat in his chair, half asleep, a book resting on his chest. He opened his eyes when he heard me and smiled. "Hey. You're back." I nodded, hanging up my coat. "Everything go okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Fine." He returned to his book, and I stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go. Upstairs, I changed into my nightclothes and washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror and studied the reflection. The lines were still there. The fatigue. But there was something else now, too. A steadiness. A new kind of quiet I didn't know how to name. I lay down beside him, careful not to disturb him. He turned slightly in his sleep, murmured something I couldn't make out, then settled. And I stared at the ceiling, wondering how long I could live in two versions of myself before one of them stopped waiting. The morning after the greenhouse session, I woke with a sense of stillness so unfamiliar it felt foreign. My body was calm, not restless. My mind, however, was thick with silence. Not confusion, not guilt, just a strange kind of clarity that hovered like fog that hadn't yet burned off with the sun. The day moved slowly, deliberately. The kind of day where everything looks too sharp, too defined. Like reality itself is daring you to blink. He didn't message me. I didn't message him. There was a mutual understanding, perhaps. A need to allow the moment its own gravity without immediately anchoring it to consequence. Sometimes silence is a form of respect. Sometimes it's avoidance. I spent most of the day cleaning the house, not because it was messy, but because I needed something tangible to hold on to. Something I could control. I scrubbed the grout between the kitchen tiles. I rearranged books in the living room that had already been in order. I even opened the hallway closet and pulled everything out, one item at a time, as if uncluttering the space might unclutter me. My husband came home earlier than usual. He seemed distracted, though not in a way that suggested suspicion. More like the kind of distraction that comes from fatigue. He told me about a colleague retiring, about the office politics surrounding it. I listened, nodding, offering the right comments at the right moments. But all the while, I felt like an actor hitting her cues. Later that evening, while I was folding laundry upstairs, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the photographer. Just one sentence. "I've printed something I'd like you to see." No emojis. No signatures. Just that. I stared at the message for a while before typing a response. "When?" A few moments passed. "Tomorrow afternoon. I'll leave the door unlocked." That was all. The next day, I didn't dress like I normally did. No bright scarf, no soft perfume. I chose a dark sweater and flat shoes. Nothing that would stand out. Nothing that would say I was hoping for anything. When I arrived, the studio was quiet. The lights were dim, the curtains pulled slightly to soften the light. He didn't greet me right away. Instead, he stood by the wall, facing a single framed photograph mounted on a white panel. It was me. But not one of the portraits I remembered from before. This one was different. I was seated, looking off to the left, my hand raised mid-gesture. My expression was unreadable, not posed, not emotive, but somewhere between thought and stillness. The photo was in black and white, but it felt warm. Alive. Honest. I stepped closer. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and even. I didn't plan to include this one. But it stayed with me. I continued to look at the image. I recognized the moment it was taken, just after a break in one of our sessions, when we had been discussing whether some emotions are better left unspoken. I hadn't realized the camera was still on. Or maybe I had. Maybe I just didn't care. I turned to him, but I didn't ask the question that hovered between us. I didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't about the photo anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. We stood there a while, quietly. The moment didn't ask for anything. No movement. No declarations. Just presence. Then, before I could say anything, before I could think myself out of it, I stepped forward and touched his arm. We kissed. We kissed. It happened without build-up, without ceremony. It was quiet, certain, like something that had already been decided long before this room, long before the camera. There was no urgency, no tension. Just a mutual, wordless acknowledgement that something had crossed a line. When I stepped back, I didn't apologize. He didn't ask for one. I left soon after. No parting words. No arrangements for another session. The drive home felt longer than usual. The roads, though familiar, seemed unfamiliar in the way that places do when something inside you has changed. Every stoplight, every intersection, felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. At home, the lights were off. He hadn't arrived yet. I walked through the front door, dropped my bag by the stairs, and stood in the middle of the living room in silence. The house, usually a place of comfort, felt too still. I sat on the couch, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. When my husband finally came home, he looked surprised to see me already there. "You're back early," he said. I nodded. "Finished sooner than I thought." He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, poured himself a glass of water. The small sounds filled the space, but not the distance. We didn't talk much that night. I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a steady hum beneath my skin. I didn't feel regret. But I did feel the shift. The unmistakable realization that something had begun, something real, something dangerous, and that pretending otherwise would only delay the unraveling that had already started. I wasn't sure what the next day would bring. But I knew the story had moved past the point of return. The following morning came with a weight I couldn't place, a dense, quiet heaviness that settled in my chest like fog refusing to lift. I moved through my routine with the same careful rhythm I had adopted for weeks now, but everything felt slightly off, slightly shifted, like a picture that had been nudged just enough to sit crooked on the wall. My husband was already gone by the time I came downstairs. His coffee mug sat rinsed beside the sink, the paper folded neatly on the table, the car missing from the driveway. Everything in its place. Everything routine. And yet, the silence felt louder than usual. I sipped my coffee slowly, standing by the window, watching the light creep along the hardwood floors. The sky was gray, but not stormy, just tired. I knew the feeling. There was a message on my phone from the gallery curator reminding me of our upcoming meeting. She wanted to finalize which prints would be featured. The exhibition was no longer a distant concept. It was days away now. A public reveal. A moment of reckoning, whether I admitted it or not. I stared at the message for a long time without responding. The thought of those images, my images, being framed and hung on stark white walls, observed by strangers under bright lights, should have made me proud. But it didn't. Not entirely. It made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of how I looked, but because of what I'd allowed to be captured. There were moments in those frames that weren't meant for public consumption. They were too honest. Too real. By midday, I felt restless. I tried to distract myself by organizing the linen closet, sorting through drawers that didn't need sorting, wiping down counters that were already clean. It didn't help. My hands were busy, but my mind kept drifting, to the studio, to his eyes behind the lens, to the way he had looked at me after we kissed, as if there was nothing left to say. The silence between us had stretched. No new messages. No updates. And yet, the absence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a breath being held. I wondered how long it would last. Later that afternoon, I stepped out for a walk. I didn't take a route I normally took. I let my feet decide, following sidewalks I hadn't noticed before, cutting through quiet streets lined with sleeping cars and overgrown hedges. I walked without purpose, hoping motion might soothe the unease in my chest. Eventually, I found myself near the studio. Not directly in front of it, but close enough to feel its pull. I didn't go inside. I didn't even slow down. I just kept walking, pretending I was on my way somewhere else. But I wasn't. When I returned home, the sun had dipped behind the trees. The light in the house had shifted into that soft, amber hue that made everything look a little kinder, a little older. I made dinner quietly, chopping vegetables with deliberate care, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. He arrived home just as I was setting the table. He looked tired, his shoulders sloped slightly forward, his tie loosened at the neck. He smiled when he saw me, and it was genuine, if not entirely awake. We ate in silence at first. Then, somewhere between the second and third bite, he spoke. "Have you decided what you're wearing to the exhibit?" I looked up, surprised. "You know about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He nodded. "Saw the flyer on the kitchen desk a few days ago. The one from the gallery." Didn't want to pry. I felt my stomach tighten. "It's just a small showing," I said. "Mostly portraits. Nothing elaborate." He nodded again, chewing slowly. "Still. It's a big deal. You should be proud." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure how. After dinner, I cleared the table while he went upstairs to shower. I lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, letting the sound of water through the ceiling pipes fill the silence. I thought about the photos again. About how, when I first saw them, they felt like a revelation. A glimpse into a part of myself I thought I'd lost. But now, with the exhibit approaching, they felt like a confession I wasn't sure I was ready to make. I went upstairs and changed into my night clothes, brushing my teeth slowly, carefully. My reflection in the mirror didn't look much different, but something behind my eyes had changed. There was a quiet intensity there, a kind of knowing. When I slipped into bed beside him, he was already lying down, the light on his nightstand still glowing. He was reading a book I didn't recognize. I turned off my lamp and settled under the covers, staring at the ceiling again, my body still, my thoughts loud. He spoke into the darkness. "I hope you know I'm proud of you. Even if I don't say it often." My throat tightened. I wanted to turn to him, to ask why it took so long to say those words. But I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you." Silence followed, stretching between us like a thread pulled too tightly. Eventually, his breathing slowed. He drifted off, the book resting on his chest again, unread. I stayed awake for a long time. Not thinking about the photographer. Not about the kiss. Not even about the exhibition. I was thinking about how two people can live in the same space, share the same bed, the same meals, the same history, and yet carry entirely separate lives in their minds. entire worlds of thought, of desire, of doubt, that never intersect. I had lived with this man for over 2 decades, and still, there were things I couldn't bring myself to say aloud. And now, there were things I'd done that I would never be able to explain, even if I tried. That night, before sleep finally claimed me, I made a quiet decision. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't run from it. Even if I didn't know what I wanted, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. Because it had. And pretending otherwise would only make the truth louder. The day of the exhibition arrived with a kind of quiet gravity, as though even the sky understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The morning was overcast, a pale gray light filtering through the bedroom curtains as I stood before the mirror, staring at my reflection with the strange detachment of someone studying a stranger. The face looking back at me was familiar, yet unfamiliar. Older, yes. Wiser, maybe. But not just that. There was a calmness beneath the surface, a kind of earned steadiness. Not peace, exactly, but acceptance. I chose my outfit carefully. Something understated, clean, elegant. Not a statement piece, not something that begged for attention. I didn't want to be seen as the centerpiece, even though I knew I was. I wanted to blend in and observe from the quiet corners of the gallery, to witness how people reacted to the images without knowing I was the one in them. Downstairs, my husband was already dressed. He was standing by the table, sipping coffee, scrolling through his phone. When he looked up and saw me, something flickered in his expression. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered longer than usual. "You ready?" I asked, reaching for my coat. He nodded, setting the mug down. "Yeah. Let's go." The drive to the gallery was mostly silent. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on his leg, his posture relaxed in a way that felt almost rehearsed. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past, every familiar street now carrying a different kind of tension. The gallery was already buzzing when we arrived. Soft jazz played through the speakers, and the sound of quiet conversation filled the air. Guests wandered from piece to piece, glasses of wine in hand, murmuring impressions to one another in that performative hush that always accompanies gallery spaces. The photographs were beautifully displayed, large, evenly lit, spaced in a way that gave each image its own breath. Seeing them framed and mounted was surreal. I had looked at these images for weeks on a screen, scrutinizing every detail, every line in my face, every nuance in my posture. But here, surrounded by strangers, they took on a new life. They no longer belonged solely to me. My husband walked beside me at first, offering a few polite comments, nodding occasionally at compliments from other guests. He seemed engaged, even proud. I watched him interact with the curator, listened to him describe the process as if he had been beside me for all of it. It was strange, watching him occupy this version of the story, one where he was supportive, involved, present. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You really did something here. People are responding to it." I smiled politely. "Thank you." And then I slipped away. I needed air. Space. A moment to myself. I found it in one of the smaller side rooms, a more intimate corner of the gallery where only a few guests lingered. One of the final images in the series hung on the far wall, one I hadn't seen printed before. It was the greenhouse portrait. The one from our last session. I hadn't realized it had made the final cut. There I was, standing in profile, my hands slightly raised, mid-motion. The light behind me filtered through the dirty glass like a veil, softening the edges of the frame. I looked still and yet not still. Quiet, but not passive. There was something suspended in the image, like a breath held just before the exhale. And beside me, without warning, he appeared. He stood at a slight angle, not too close, not too distant. We didn't look at each other. We looked at the photograph. For a moment, we stood like that, suspended in silence, in the presence of something we both recognized but couldn't name aloud. "I didn't know this one was going to be here," I said quietly. He nodded. It felt right. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because it did. It felt right. And wrong. And everything in between. The room felt smaller with him in it. Not in a suffocating way, but in the way that moments become more intense when you realize they're finite. I could feel his presence like heat on my skin, even though he didn't move. He turned slightly then, his voice barely above a whisper. We spent the night together. Just like that. No embellishment. No hidden meaning. Just the truth, laid bare in 7 words. I didn't flinch. I didn't deny it. Because it was true. And as soon as he said it, I knew someone else had heard it. I turned my head slowly, heart thudding in my chest, and saw my husband standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. His face didn't contort in anger. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. For a moment, time folded. Then he turned and walked away, not fast, not dramatic, just gone. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, the words forming too slowly behind my teeth. By the time I moved to follow, he had disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the evening blurred. People continued to compliment the exhibit. They smiled, asked questions, praised the intimacy of the work. I nodded, answered when I could, and excused myself more often than was polite. I wasn't present anymore. I was fractured. My body remained in the gallery, but my mind was chasing footsteps that had already vanished down a quiet hall. When the night finally ended, I left without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home alone. The house was dark when I arrived. His car was gone. His shoes weren't by the door. His jacket wasn't on the hook. Everything else remained where it always was, but his absence was deafening. I stood in the entryway, keys still in my hand, unsure what to do next. Eventually, I walked to the living room, sat on the couch, and waited. But he didn't come home. And in the quiet that followed, I finally understood. There would be a cost. And it had already begun. The morning after the exhibition was eerily quiet. I woke to a hollow kind of stillness, the kind that fills a house not just with silence, but with absence. His side of the bed was cold. The sheets undisturbed. The room carried no scent of aftershave or the usual faint rustle of his morning routine. Only the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs reminded me that the world was still turning. I lay there for a while, unmoving, trying to piece together the shape of what had broken. There hadn't been a confrontation. No slammed doors or shouted accusations. Only that look. That devastating, wordless recognition in his eyes before he turned and left. And now, what? A disappearing act? A silent verdict? Eventually, I got up. The floor felt colder than usual beneath my feet, or maybe it was just me. I moved through the motions of making coffee, but even the act of pouring water felt heavier than it should have. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, swirling slowly, like time itself had thickened overnight. His car was still gone. His coat still missing from the hook. I checked the guest room, the study, even the garage, as if part of me believed he might be somewhere inside the house, just out of view. But he wasn't. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands wrapped around the coffee mug. They didn't feel like my hands. They felt like someone else's, someone who had made a decision she hadn't fully understood. Someone who had told herself a story about control and freedom and rediscovery, without ever truly accounting for the collateral damage. By mid-morning, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, a text arrived from the gallery coordinator thanking me for a powerful and moving evening, and confirming that several of the pieces had already drawn interest from collectors. I stared at the message, unable to feel anything in response. Not pride. Not accomplishment. Not even fear. Just numbness. At noon, I forced myself to eat something, though I barely tasted it. The house felt too large, each room echoing the absence in a slightly different key. The living room felt abandoned. The bedroom, invaded. The kitchen, unfamiliar. I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting him to walk in and say something, anything, but it remained closed, unmoved by my wishes. I sat down at my computer and opened the folder with the original photographs. The ones from the early sessions. I scrolled through them slowly, watching my own face change. Not drastically, not all at once, but gradually. A soft shift in posture. A different kind of focus in the eyes. A loosening of something that had been tightly wound for years. And then I saw it. A file I didn't recognize. The title was just a number, a timestamp, maybe, but it didn't match the naming format of the others. Curious, I opened it. It was a video. The footage was short. Less than a minute. Grainy. It had been captured on a secondary camera, probably by accident, during one of our final sessions. I remembered the setup. He'd mentioned wanting to record lighting adjustments. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. But in this clip, I was visible. Sitting in the greenhouse, my head tilted slightly to the side, laughing at something he'd said just off frame. The camera caught the moment I reached to brush hair from my face, the soft curve of a smile that I hadn't worn in years. There was nothing scandalous. Nothing overt. But it was intimate. Deeply, undeniably so. The kind of moment that meant something only if you knew the context. And I had no idea how it had ended up saved. Or whether someone else had seen it. My chest tightened. I closed the file and stared at the screen for a long time, heart racing. The moment that had felt so private, so controlled, now seemed porous. Fragile. And I realized just how precariously I'd balanced everything, how a single slip could shift the entire narrative. It wasn't just about what had happened between me and the photographer. It was about what it had meant. And who else now knew it? I reached for my phone and dialed my husband's number, fingers trembling slightly. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried again an hour later. Still no answer. The sun was beginning to set when I finally heard the sound of a key in the lock. I turned quickly, pulse surging. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and looked at me. No words. He walked past me into the kitchen, set down a paper bag of groceries, and began unpacking it. As if nothing had happened. As if it were just another day. I followed him, unsure of what to say. He moved slowly, deliberately, milk in the fridge, apples in the bowl, bread on the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady. I stayed at a hotel. Just needed time. I nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. He looked at me then. Really looked. And there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not betrayal. Just sadness. A tired, deep sadness that made my chest ache. You kissed him, he said. Not a question. A fact. I didn't deny it. We kissed. The words felt heavy on my tongue. But I owed him the truth. At the very least, I owed him that. He exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the edge of the counter. Is it over? Again, not a question full of suspicion or jealousy. Just an attempt to locate himself in the wreckage. I nodded. Yes. And I meant it. I had to. He didn't speak again. Not for a while. Just stood there, shoulders hunched slightly, staring out the window above the sink. I wanted to explain. To tell him how it happened. Why? What I had been missing. But no explanation would change what I had done. No reasoning would undo what had fractured. Eventually, he turned away from the window, picked up his bag, and walked upstairs. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. And I remained standing in the kitchen, alone once more. But this time, not with uncertainty. With consequence. The next few days passed in a strange suspension of movement and silence, like a house holding its breath. We spoke very little, bare essentials only. Schedules, groceries, questions that required answers. The warmth in our voices was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost clinical courtesy. But it wasn't cold. Just cautious. Like walking barefoot across broken glass, one small step at a time. He didn't ask more questions, and I didn't volunteer more answers. The moment in the kitchen, the question, the admission, the retreat, had drawn a silent boundary between us. We both seemed to understand that nothing productive would come from dragging each other through the emotional wreckage too soon. Or maybe we both just needed space to think without pressure, without performance. I tried to resume normalcy. I went to the market, prepared meals, replied to emails from the gallery. I returned calls I had ignored in the wake of the exhibit, answered polite questions about future projects, feigned enthusiasm where I could. But everything felt muted, like I was living behind a pane of glass, watching myself go through motions that no longer felt tethered to meaning. The photographer didn't reach out. And I didn't reach out to him. That silence carried its own weight. One evening, I sat at the dining table, sorting through the remaining prints from the exhibit. The gallery had returned several framed copies to me, images that hadn't sold or been claimed. I unwrapped them one by one, wiping the glass gently with a cloth, careful not to smudge or scratch. When I reached the greenhouse portrait, the one he had added last minute, I paused. The expression on my face in that image was more complicated than I remembered. I had thought it captured stillness, maybe a kind of quiet power. But now, looking at it again, I saw something else. Something harder to name. A question that had never been answered. I set the frame aside. Later that night, he came home later than usual. I was already in bed, reading with the light dimmed. I heard the garage door open, then the soft shuffle of his footsteps across the floorboards. He entered the room quietly, placed his keys on the dresser, and sat at the edge of the bed to remove his shoes. I watched him from the corner of my eye. He looked tired. Not just from work, but from effort. The effort of maintaining this new quiet, this daily restraint. There was tension in the way he moved. Careful, measured. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the weight of what he wanted to say, hovering just beneath the surface. And then he said it. I went to see her today. I closed the book slowly, placed it on the nightstand. Her? The curator, he replied, still not looking at me. She reached out. Said there were some things I should know. I waited. My pulse tightened in my throat. She showed me the full exhibit. Not just the display from the night of the opening, but the digital collection. The backroom files. I turned to face him fully now. My breath shallow. She said some of the images had been pulled before the final cut. And one video. The word hit me like a sudden gust of wind. My fingers curled slightly beneath the covers. She said it wasn't supposed to be archived. That it wasn't part of the official submission. But it was there. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. She said it wasn't explicit. Nothing like that. But it was clear. He finally looked at me then. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was just deeply tired. I think the hardest part, he said softly, is realizing that I didn't even notice you were disappearing. That you'd been gone for a while. And I didn't see it. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. Not because he had said something cruel. But because he had said something true. I didn't know how to tell you, I whispered. I know, he replied. And that's part of it, too. We sat in silence for a while, the space between us not entirely broken, but not yet mended. Just there. Eventually, he stood, walked into the bathroom, and closed the door behind him. I lay back on the pillow, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding with the ache of what had been said and what hadn't. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. He left a note on the kitchen counter, folded neatly beside my mug. Gone to see my brother. Back Sunday. No emotion. No signature. Just a fact. I held the note in my hands for a long time, staring at the clean handwriting, the gentle curve of his letters. He wasn't leaving. But he was stepping away. And I understood that he needed to. The rest of the day, I floated. I couldn't focus on work. I couldn't cook. I couldn't even bring myself to reply to messages. I walked through the house like a ghost in her own life, touching objects just to feel grounded. The armrest of the couch. The banister. The cool porcelain of the sink. That afternoon, I stood in my studio room, surrounded by the photographs, and took down the frames one by one. I wrapped them in soft cloth, packed them carefully into boxes. I wasn't hiding them. I just needed them to rest. By evening, I found myself outside, standing at the end of the driveway, staring up at the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, flickering faintly in the quiet dusk. The world felt still, almost forgiving. I thought about how love wasn't always loud. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet. A hand resting on your back after a long day. A look across the table. A cup of coffee made without asking. And sometimes, when love went missing, it didn't slam the door. It just stopped looking up when you walked into the room. And I had let that happen. And now, I had to live with the version of myself who did. But I wasn't going to run. Not anymore. Sunday arrived cloaked in soft sunlight, the kind that filters through sheer curtains and makes shadows dance across hardwood floors. It was the kind of morning that usually held promise, fresh coffee, quiet music, maybe the gentle thrum of a distant lawnmower, but today, it only amplified the stillness of the house. Every clock ticked too loudly, every drawer I opened felt like an intrusion. He hadn't returned yet. I told myself not to read into it. The note had said back Sunday, not back Sunday morning. But time felt different now, stretched, brittle. Every hour that passed fed a quiet fear inside me, not of abandonment, but of transformation. Of who we might become if too much space settled between us. I spent most of the morning outside. The weather was gentle, and I needed movement. I pulled weeds from the garden with hands that were clumsy from disuse. Trimmed branches. Swept leaves from the patio. It wasn't about productivity, it was about trying to clear something. The debris, the fog, the weight of unspoken things. Inside, the gallery boxes still sat stacked in the corner of the dining room. I hadn't touched them since packing them away. But now, I opened one. Slowly, carefully. I unwrapped the greenhouse photo first. Laid it flat on the table. I looked at it not as a piece of art, not even as a symbol, but simply as a record. Of a moment. Of a version of myself I had uncovered, perhaps too late. I set it aside and unwrapped another. This one was from early on, before everything tilted. I was seated in the studio, head tilted slightly, eyes not quite meeting the camera. There was hesitation in my posture. Restraint. I remembered that day. How uncertain I had felt, how far away from myself I had been. But looking at the image now, I also saw something else. The very beginning of the unraveling. The first thread pulled. I spent the next hour unpacking the rest. Not to hang them. Not to judge them. Just to see. To acknowledge. Then I rewrapped them. Each one. Slowly. Respectfully. It was mid-afternoon when I heard the car door outside. My heart stuttered. I stood by the window, watching him step out. He moved slowly, his shoulders slightly hunched, a small duffel bag in one hand. He paused at the door for a moment before coming in. I stayed in the living room. When he entered, he didn't speak right away. He set his bag down by the stairs and glanced around the space, his eyes briefly landing on the framed photos stacked by the wall. Then he looked at me. "Hi," he said, his voice even, neutral. "Hi," I replied. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. I followed, unsure of what came next, unsure whether I was walking into a conversation or an ending. He leaned against the counter, sipping slowly, his gaze steady but not cold. "I thought a lot this weekend," he began, "about what I was angry about. What hurt the most?" I said nothing. Let him speak. "And the truth is, it wasn't the kiss. It wasn't even the lie." My stomach tightened. "It was that you let someone else see you when I didn't. And that you didn't think I'd want to." The words landed with more force than any raised voice ever could. "I didn't know how to show you," I whispered. "Not anymore." It started to feel like the space between us had rules I didn't understand. He nodded slowly. "I think I stopped asking. And maybe you stopped offering. And we both just let it stay that way." Another pause. This one heavier. Not empty, but full of memory. Of late-night silences. Missed glances. Dinners eaten with forks scraping porcelain instead of words. "I'm not leaving," he said finally. "But I don't know how to go back either." "I don't want to go back," I said. "I want to go forward. But I don't know how to do that yet." His shoulders lowered slightly, the tension shifting. Not gone, but softer. Like we had finally stepped onto the same page, even if we were still holding different parts of the story. We didn't talk much more that day. There wasn't a list to go through, no solutions to strategize. Just a quiet agreement that we weren't giving up, even if we didn't know what rebuilding looked like. That evening, I made dinner. He helped. We moved around the kitchen in a rhythm we hadn't shared in a long time. Passing knives, seasoning with unspoken signals, washing and drying side by side. Not like nothing had happened, but like something new was trying to begin. We ate at the table without music. The silence was gentler now. Later, we sat in the living room. I pulled out a single photograph, the one from the early session, where I looked almost lost. I placed it between us. He studied it for a long time. "You look like you're waiting for something," he said. "Maybe I was," I replied. We didn't need to say more. That night, we went to bed without touching. But we both faced each other. And for the first time in weeks, I slept.